So, here's what we're gonna do. First thing we're gonna talk about, first animal I'm gonna talk about, and I'm just reaching into my brain because I've got a whole bunch of information in there that I'd like to tell you about. So, let's start with this one. Let's start with this one. Good Lord. I'm telling you, I think they're already on to me. I think they're like, nope, we're not doing that. We're not letting you go off script. What is the problem? All right, well, I'll just hit the button over here then. Or maybe I won't. I'll tell you what, we'll start this all over from the beginning and see if things want to cooperate. Please. There we go. All right, let's talk about this guy. Now, you've probably heard of this fish. Certainly if you've seen Finding Nemo, right? This fish comes across there. The anglerfish, right? This is a fish that lives in deep, deep water, presumably where it's totally black all the time. It's got a light on its head. We know that it does this in order to attract things to that light. And then because it has such a gruesome mouth, it eats those things. These concepts that we've already accepted are, in fact, as far as we know, absolutely true. That's not what I'm here to tell you about. What I'm here to tell you about is give you a little more real pictures of how this fish looks and tell a little bit more about its life cycle. Now, there are more than one species of anglerfish. There are quite a few, because keep in mind, they exist in deep water and the bottom of the ocean is really, really big. Remember, 75% of the earth is covered by water, so there's a lot of different species living out there. Not only that, we have done a very poor job of exploring the oceans, the deep oceans. So we don't even know. I would bet my left arm there are species of this animal out there that we don't even know exist yet. But in general, the ones we do know exist, and the way they live is fascinating. Most of the animals that you see here, that you're familiar with in your mind when someone says anglerfish, and you think about this, these are female, all of them. The males function in a fascinating way. They are parasitic, for lack of a better term. I know there's a lot of women in the audience now going like, yeah, of course they are. Of course they are. The way they function, the males are very, very, very small in comparison to the size of the female. The way they function, the males swim around and they've got one job only, pass on their DNA. They cannot really catch their own food. They can't do anything else. So what they do is they smell the water, looking for pheromones released by a female who is in her cycle, a female that is sexually mature. They follow that smell until they can find a female. Most of the time they don't. Most of the time they die long before they get to her. Because keep in mind, they can't catch their own food. So they're just working on whatever they have left in their system that they were born with. That's it. They have a limited amount of time. It's like you took a wind-up toy and you wound it up. When that spring runs out, that toy is done moving. Same thing with these males on the bottom of the ocean. If they happen to find a female, they bite on and they grab onto her. Now, what happens after that varies a little bit by species. I'm going to tell you what happens most frequently and what I find to be the most interesting. These parasitic males, and the female, for most of the species, can have more than one parasitic male on her. They start dissolving. They have mouths that look quite like this, because keep in mind, they're not catching their own food, but they do have big, teethy mouths, and they bite on, and they literally dissolve into the female. Their internal organs basically disappear, and their sperm enters the female this way. It's not classic sex. There's no penis, there's no vagina. There's just a fish biting a much larger fish, a fish 100 times maybe his size and just melting into her. And so females who have had males do that, eventually all that's left are those teeth holding on. And eventually the teeth fall off and the male is completely dissolved into her. And this is fascinating, and it blows the minds of scientists, because these fish are not genetic duplicates from each other, right? They're completely individual. While they have a lot of the same DNA because of the same species, they're still individuals. If I were to take my liver and shove it inside you, your body is going to reject it. Your body is going to be like, what is it? No, this isn't from me. And it would attack it. What we've discovered about how this is possible is it's exactly the same thing. This male is dissolving into the female. Completely separate organism, completely separate, slightly separate genetic makeup, but completely foreign to her body. What we've discovered is that this particular species of fish basically shuts down their immune system so that they don't have that autonomic response to a foreign body entering them, which is what makes their reproduction possible. But it also opens them up to a whole bunch of other problems. If they get cut down there and they get bacterial infection, if they get worms burrowing into them, their body doesn't have the innate response that another fishes would have, because they've shut that system down in order to make it possible for them to reproduce. It's a completely unique life history. They said, okay, here's the route everyone else is going. You know what? I'm going to go this way. They just took a whole side route, and this is how they do it. This is an adult female. Keep in mind, like I said, there's a bunch of different species. This is one of the more horrific ones, in my opinion. This is just ugly. Looks like it's a mummy or something, but it's not. This is what it would look like alive. And this thing on top here, that's the male. That male has bitten her and hasn't quite dissolved into her yet. But in this species, that is what's happening. And you can see the size differential there. The male is just a little tiny swimming bag of sperm that's gonna bite into that female and melt into her. It's wild, right? It's you would never think about this. From what you know from Disney, this is not how you expected the anglerfish to live, right? This is exactly how they live. The animals that live at depth have very unique life histories, in particular because one, food is very, very limited. Two, obviously there's no light. Three, the chance of you running into another member of your same species, and particularly of the opposite sex, is very, very, very limited. So you have to be able to take full advantage in whatever sort of way you can. And this is how the anglerfish decided to do that. I think it's fascinating. I hope you guys are equally like, wow, that kind of blew my mind. It's a little bit gross. I hope it wasn't. Wish you would have shown me that after lunch. This is another deep water fish. Sometimes we call it the flashlight fish, although flashlight fish is also a very popular aquarium fish, or you see it in the public aquariums people have in their homes. It's also called the dragonfish, the deep sea flashlight fish. It has a bunch of different names. It's the Aristomeus genus. But you can see here, and this picture's a little bit blurry, this is a deep sea fish, and deep sea fish consistently have big fangs. And there's one reason for this. Because if you live on the bottom of the ocean, when something bumps into you, it's a battle. You are going to try to eat them, they're going to try to eat you. And there's lots of fish that live down there that have very thin, sort of expandable stomachs, so they can actually consume organisms bigger than themselves. That's why all these fish, like, even if we go back, I mean, you can't see a full body in this picture, but if we go back for 1 second, that one's actually not a great picture, but here, look how small that tail is, and look how huge that head and that mouth is. Why? Because this fish isn't going swimming anywhere. It lives in the middle of a desert where it may not run into other organisms for months. So there's no point in it swimming around. The point is, what a lot of animals do at at depth, they just wait. They wait for something to approach them. The unlikely chance that based on current being drifted on the currents, you run into another organism, or you feel the pressure waves of another organism, then you try to eat it. It's basically the knee-jerk reaction of these deep sea animals. And this fish is no different, the flashlight fish. You can see that it's got these fangs, and that's the reason. These teeth, exactly the same as in the anglerfish, these aren't meant for cutting flesh. When you see a fish with needle-like teeth, there's one purpose. It is to pierce through the meat and hold on. It's so that that animal cannot get away. I bite you, there's no way you're getting out of this. I have just driven a bunch of harpoons, a bunch of stakes, a bunch of spears through you. You are not going anywhere. This is why their teeth all look like that. It's why they don't have, they're not great white teeth with little serrated edges. They're not talking about tearing up meat. They're like, I have not run into another organism in 3 or 4 months. I'm not letting this one get away. I'm going to eat it, whatever it is. So the flashlight fish is very, very unique. And I'll tell you how. This part's gonna blow your mind. You remember when the first lecture I did on corals, for those of you that were here on the coral reefs, I talked about how, and I showed you this image of a bunch of different colorations, little tubes with different colors, and I talked about how at depth, remember, what was the first color that disappeared as you started going down? You guys remember? Red, exactly right. So red disappears really close to the surface. So sure as heck, down where there is no light at all, none of the fish that live down there, almost none of the fish, have the ability to see the color red. It's irrelevant. Why would they? It'd be a waste of energy to develop those cells in their eyeballs to see a color that will never exist down there. Except the flashlight fish. This fish, evolutionarily, and I don't know how this came about, because obviously I'm not God, they evolved. A lot of the animals down there who create light have little pockets of bacteria. They create bioluminescence. This fish, at some point, created a covering, a tissue covering over that pocket of bioluminescence that stained that light coming out of those bacterium red. And at the same time, developed the cells in the eyes to see the color red. What this allows this fish to do, basically, is be in a pitch black room. Let's imagine we're all in a pitch black room, only I've got a flashlight that only I can see. The rest of you can't see it. I could walk around and look at all of you. You would have no idea I'm doing it because you can't see the light. But meanwhile, I can see all of you. I could find one, like, oh yeah, I could definitely consume that person. Like, absolutely, that's how this fish operates. It's a huge evolutionary advantage for this animal. When you think about it in those ways, pitch black, you've got a light only you can see. None of the fish even know that wavelength of light exists because their eyes can't deal with it. Now this fish also has other pockets of bioluminescence on it, but it has the ability, and like all the fish that have bioluminescence, they can turn on and off. They have these pockets that keep this bacteria in. They can suck that bacteria deeper into that pocket and sort of pinch it closed. That's how they reduce the amount of light that's coming out from this. That's how they can turn these things on and off. So it can do the same way with regular bioluminescence, which exists a little bit further down and on the sides of its body. But it can also suck those in, turn them off, and just be broadcasting this red light that only it can see. And this, in my opinion, is fascinating. That is a fascinating evolutionary advantage that this animal has. So here's a picture of it, and I realize it's blurry because I stole it from the internet, and then I blew it up really big. So, but this is what it looks like, and you can see. So it's that sort of green orb on top of that's its eye. You can see that it's got that red light coming out right by its eye, so that whatever it bounces off of and reflects back in, its eye can see. And then behind it is its regular bioluminescent patch that it can turn on and off whenever it needs to. If it wants to go totally dark, run silent, run deep, that's exactly what it's doing here. I think it's an incredibly fascinating evolutionary advantage this animal has. Another interesting combination of things that exist Whales and barnacles. Now, you've probably seen this. Certainly, you've all seen barnacles at some point in your life, I'm sure. Right? You go down to your local dock, your pier, the beach with some rocks. You see these things growing on the rocks, right? And when the tide goes out, they seal up because they seal some water inside them. They wait for the tide to come back in, they open it back up, they start feeding, they start breathing again. That's how they exist. My question to you is, have you ever thought about, well, how the heck do they get onto these whales? Like, how does that happen? Like, you get it on the rocks, they're right next to each other, but how do they get on the whales? They're swimming through the middle of the ocean, especially the humpback whales, right? Traveling from places like Hawaii all the way up to Alaska. How does that happen? They're not going up the shore, they're sure as heck not rubbing on the rocks. How do they get barnacles on them? And how do the barnacles reproduce? It's interesting. I don't want to get too deep into it because frankly, this is one of my favorite animals to talk about with regard to the Sex in the Sea lecture. I will tell you, spoiler alert, barnacles have, by body size, the largest penis in the entire animal kingdom. By far. It's like 20 times their size, the body size. It's ridiculous. And the reason for that makes perfect sense. Because they're sessile animals. They can't move, right? So unless you're a broadcast spawner, like say an abalone is, or...
Good morning everyone, this is the captain speaking for the navigation of bridge. It is now 11:50 and we should provide you some information about us and weather conditions.
I don't think that's terribly important. So as much as I like the captain, I'm going to go ahead and talk over him. He's saying it's really nice outside. You guys should have a great day. And I concur. Thank you, Captain. Back to barnacle penises. So what happens is, these animals are sessile. They can't move. So they have to reach out and touch someone, as it were. So the males hope that there is a female within reach, and they go over and that's how they deposit their sperm. In some species we found recently, this is a new discovery, in the last 15 years, when I say new, I mean newish, we found that some barnacles, especially ones that live in very high, areas where high waves occur, their penises are much shorter. And the reason for that is because it'd get ripped off if a big wave came by, and that is going to defeat your purpose in life if you're an animal. You want to pass your DNA off, and if you're missing that part of your body, it makes it really difficult to do that. So those groups of animals have smaller penises, and they actually don't reach out and internally fertilize female barnacles. What they do instead is basically just shoot it in the right direction. You go, oh, there you are, blah. And hopefully the female at the time, because this is all very timed according to when the season is right, when the female is ready. She's sitting there sweeping things in, so she's just picking up the sperm, and that's how her eggs get fertilized. So this is a general, and that was just in a nutshell how barnacles reproduce. But the question is, how does this happen on the whales, right? Because eventually, obviously it makes sense, maybe it makes sense when you've got a group of them right there, but if you're a brand new whale, if you were just born, you weren't born with barnacles, how'd you get them in the first place? So these barnacles, these what we call pelagic barnacles, these are organisms that are not living along the coastline. These are organisms that are expecting to be wet 24 hours a day. They're not expecting to have a period of time where the tide drops and all of a sudden they have to hold their breath for 6 hours. They're not equipped to do that. They can't seal up that way. These animals have a completely different strategy. They're the same type of animal, basic same structure, but completely different strategy for life. They're not broadcast spawners. They'll still fertilize their neighbor, but the larvae get ejected into the plankton layer of the ocean, and they try to time this ejection to when the whales are going to be getting together. So they'll do this when the whales are feeding, when the whales are reproducing, when you got a bunch of animals in a small space. And it's not like they're checking their calendars or looking around. They don't have eyes, they don't have calendars. but they've timed it with regard to water chemistry and temperature so that they can release these larvae, release these fertilized eggs at the right time when there's a dense amount of animals for them, those hatched eggs to cling to. And what happens is very unique. Let me show you. This is just 2 images of whales with. I'm going to show you some more. They tend to gravitate towards the front of the whale or the fins of the whale. You very rarely see barnacles near the tail or near the tail flukes or the what we call a caudal peduncle, the back end of the animal. You typically never see them back there. You see them up near the face for the most part, sometimes on the fins. And the reason for this, we assume, because again, the barnacles, they're terrible at calling us back. So they haven't answered our questions. We think that they do this because this is the part, the head of the animal is where they're going to be the most food, right? Obviously the tail is attached to the same animal, so it's going to be swimming through an area thick with food, but the head is going to be where the most food is because that's where the animal's mouth is, so it wants to be there. So what happens is, these larvae hatch. They're drifting planktonically. The whales are swimming through there. Now, barnacles are arthropods. And it's hard to think of it. You think of it as some sort of like shell, like it's a bivalve or something, like it's more related to clams or oysters or something, right? They're not. They're related to shrimp. Specifically, they actually broke off the evolutionary chain that led to the arthropods on Earth. So spiders, scorpions, those things, those are the closest relatives to barnacles, believe it or not. It's fascinating. These animals are basically, if you can think of like a small cocktail shrimp living head down inside of the shell and then kicking food into its mouth. That's basically how they work. It's sort of hard to explain beyond that without getting stupid technical, but that's how they live. And they have to go through a metamorphosis, obviously, to get to that phase. So, they're crawling around, but because they're part of this arthropod group, they've got some antennae. The pelagic barnacles have modified their antennae to basically function like ice pigs. Like if you've ever gone on, especially for those of you who are in the Alaska part of this cruise, if you went on one of those glacier hikes, if you saw people with those like ice picks to hold on, it's basically what they've modified their front antennae to do, which you can see in this image here where it says AD at the top. That's what that is. So this animal is going to be swimming around, just planktonically. A whale comes through. Now keep in mind, this doesn't happen to the killer whales. This doesn't happen to the dulls, porpoises. This doesn't happen to the animals that are moving by really, really quickly. It's really hard to, jump into a vehicle that's moving by at 80 miles an hour. It's really hard to do that. It's a lot easier when the train's going by at 6 miles an hour. You can catch that. These animals do the same thing. When the whale comes by, if it's moving slow enough, they try to grip on, and they will. They'll obviously be sliding back along the body as they do this. And as they do that, they start immediately excreting this substance that is very, very sticky, has a very high adhesive effect, and it tends to grip them to the skin of the whale. Not only that, they take these modified antennae and they bury them in like ice picks into the ice, into the whale. And this keeps them from sliding as far back as they can because they want to try to grip on. Then though, this larva is still in the larval form because obviously this doesn't look anything like a barnacle. Then this animal has to walk all the way to the front. And they have sensors. They can feel when the water flow is better, when the water flow is cleaner. They can go, yeah, this is going to be a good place for me to find food. This is where I want to build my shell. If we were the size of the larvae, compared to, say, the size of a whale, if we were these larvae, we'd have to walk about 20 miles before we'd get to the front of the whale from wherever we are when we first got on board. And we'd have to be clawing our whole 20-mile way because that whale, is moving through the water, be trying to sweep us off. So So it's not just like you're walking 20 miles at a nice leisurely pace. It's like you are walking with a bunch of water trying to sweep you off and you're holding on for dear life. That's how these animals exist. And obviously when they get to the front, then they look like the barnacles that we are familiar with. They build the shell. They suck part of the animal, part of the whale's skin into the bottom of their shell, and that's what allows them to attach. But that whole period beforehand, this is the part that nobody really thinks about. Like, well, how did that shell get there? How did they form that? This is how. Crazy ice pick using arthropod, spider scorpion relative, creeping around in the water on the backs of massive whales. Something you probably never thought about, right? But that's how it works in the ocean. Things are wild. Albatrosses. This is another bird that I discussed briefly yesterday, and I felt like I wanted to go into a little bit deeper today. Not super deep, because I covered a lot of it yesterday. These birds are fascinating, and they're fascinating because they hardly ever land on land, on terra firma. They spend their entire lives either over or on the sea. Most of the time flying, like most of the time. They will sleep in flight. They can land on the water, and they will from time to time, especially after they've eaten, give themselves a chance to digest. But most of the time, they're in flight. They're either migrating or they're foraging for food. You can tell an albatross because it has this massive, oddly shaped beak. They used to be called, and some places they will still be referred to as tube noses. And this is because they have these massive olfactory voids in their beak, which aids them in smelling. Now, these animals have, I've never smelled an albatross, so I can't tell you how strongly they're scented. But certainly, since they are all getting together on one island to breed, and they don't hang out with their mates, mind you. They mate for life, but they do not spend any time with their mates. They gotta re-find their mate, and they do it mostly by smell. So I'm guessing they have pretty unique odors. That's my guess. I don't know that to be the case, but that's my guess. Something else they use this massive void in their nose for, because they're fishing out small fish, they're fishing out squid, and they have the ability to smell these animals while those animals are in the water. That part I still am not completely buying, but people who are much more well-versed in this animal's life assure me that's true. That they can smell, I don't know how you smell a fish that's in the water when you're out of the water, but apparently they can. Their noses are very, very good. The last thing that this nose does for them, though, is when they're eating these animals out of the sea, right? They're sucking up water, they're taking in water. Because these animals need water, just like all the life on Earth. You have to get some sort of hydration, right? Where they gotta get rid of the salt. Like, they can't fly to a place and drink fresh water. That's not an option. So they gotta get rid of the salt. This salt is extruded out of these holes in their tube nose. And that's how they get rid of the excess salt so they don't die. If we had that kind of nose, you could be at sea for eons and be just fine, just drink all the seawater. But we can't do that because we don't have this freakishly big beak. These animals will get together on islands where they mate. Midway Island is one of the big ones, and that's one where we can actually monitor them pretty well. When they do that, they land on, they don't bother making much of a nest. They just sort of dig a little depression in the sand, like, I'm done, that's cool. I've been flying for the last 9 months, like, that's cool. I'm not doing any more work, I'm tired. So they dig a little depression in the sand. They find their mate. This involves a bit of smelling, like I'm saying, and a lot of squawking and calling. And eventually, when they find their mates, they have a whole elaborate dance they do, sort of reconnect with their mates, like a re-seduction, as it were. Because keep in mind, they haven't seen their mates in almost a year. So, which is probably why they're still interested in them. And so they're like, oh yeah, I forgot how good looking you are. All right, cool. Yeah, remember that thing I like? All right, can you do that to me? All right, let's have a baby. So that's basically how it works. And when they're on the sand, because they haven't bothered building a nest, that sand gets really, really hot. So you'll see these birds on the islands. Now keep in mind, when I say they're on the sand, they're just above the high tide line. They're not that far away from the water. And they're sitting there and they'll dance. Not the dance like to, hey, yeah, that's my buddy, like I wanna have a baby with you. Not that dance, not the reseduction dance. The, oh my gosh, this sand is hot dance. And they'll do this for a long time, hopping from foot to foot, because the sand is really hot. And there's no place for them to go. That's their nest. They just dug a little depression in the sand. It's not even very deep. One of the biggest problems that these birds have with regard to nesting is as we've expanded through, the South Pacific, we brought a lot of rodents with us on early sailing ships and even currently. I mean, you'll see when we're docked on our dock lines, we have those big sort of plates we stick on the lines just to keep rodents from running up under the ship. Because of the rodents that have now occupied, the small mammals occupying the lands that the albatross has stopped to breed, this is a big problem they only lay one egg per year. That's it. The rodents cause problems for the birds and their egg. A lot of the eggs in the nest that are lost are typically lost due to invasive rodents or small mammals on these islands. Animals that weren't there historically, but are there now because we brought them, and either on purpose or accidentally. And so that's one of the biggest problems with regard to the viability of the eggs for this animal. And the animal hasn't evolved yet to deal with that. I mean, eventually, hard to say, in another 100,000 years, maybe they'll be flying up in trees and building some sort of nest up there, maybe. But evolutionarily, it wasn't something they needed to do. So it wasn't a behavior they evolved into. They evolved into just digging that shallow little pit in the sand because there were no rodents, there were no small mammals to eat their eggs. They didn't need to go to all that trouble. So that's what they do. They both incubate the egg. The egg hatches, they both take care of the baby. When it fledges, they go, hey, all right. Well, I'll tell you what, Susie, it's been great. I'll see you next year. Have a good one. They take off. And that's it. That's how they do their lives. It's just a short amount of time they spend together. And I think, frankly, as a single individual in his mid-40s, I think they found the key to long-lasting relationships, frankly. They're like, yeah, that's cool. Listen, so we had a great time. It's a whole baby in the air now. I'll see you next year. Have a good one. This animal, I tried desperately hard. You have to understand that as your naturalist, while I have a whole bunch of information, I am lousy with computers. Really, really bad. And I kept trying to steal this video from YouTube, and I could not quite figure out how to do it. And to be fair, I was also having some internet connectivity issues, as I'm sure you can relate to. So, interesting thing about these bottlenose dolphins, and this is something that you probably remember from, I want to say the original video came out in either 2011 or 2013. Was a BBC video, actually, and it showed a bunch of bottlenose dolphins picking up a pufferfish, basically puff, puff, give, passing it around. And this pufferfish releases a neurotoxin, enough that it would easily kill this animal. It would kill you and I, too. Absolutely. But they limited their exposure to it. And they didn't try to kill the fish, just tried to irritate it enough that we allowed a little bit of the toxin, and they passed this pufferfish around. And the video that became very, very famous, I want to say it was 2011. I seem to remember that being the time. That video that became very, very famous, at that time, you could see them being altered. Like, they were altered. They're swimming upside down, they're getting real loopy, they're bumping into each other. They were getting high. And this is something that we found this in terrestrial animals as well. We find this in some of the higher order primates. We know that some of the chimpanzees will let fruit ferment and go after the alcohol, basically, that's formed. Now, I have my own theories about this. And basically it goes as follows. I think the more intelligent you are, maybe the more you realize how messed up the world is, and so you want to escape from it. I'm not sure. That part I'm unclear of yet. But we know that higher order animals seek to alter their state of consciousness, and humans are by no means the only one doing this. We just didn't know how dolphins did it. We know that they did it a few other ways, and I don't want to get gross on you about them. They do a lot of sexual things to alter their states of consciousness. Yeah, I'll get into that some other point. That's the after hours talk. But we know that they're doing this for the same thing, to alter their state of consciousness. That they need to see the world differently. They need to have a break from reality to enjoy themselves. And the first time this was seen to happen, people were like, I don't know what we're looking at. And then when whoever the videographer who recorded this for the BBC got image of this in late 2010 and then released it in 2011, it blew that door wide open. We said, wow, this is amazing. This is fascinating. It's something we never thought about globally as a we've never thought about it as regular people, that dolphins would get high, that would want to alter their state of consciousness, that would want to be, drunk, be a little tipsy. We never thought about that happening in animals. Well, think about it. We never thought about it happening in aquatic animals. And when this started happening, when we started seeing it, it was already happening presumably. When we started seeing it, it made perfect sense. We're like, wow, they take this very, very toxic thing, like ethanol, this very, very toxic thing. You just have a little bit of it, just a little bit, just enough, put you over the edge, make your day seem a little less bad, make the fish that you caught seem a little bit bigger when you retell the story to your buddies. It's exactly that. It's exactly that. And my personal theory is that the higher the intelligence of the animal, the more they are likely to do that. This goes into a sort of a sub-lecture that I gave, or a sub-point that I made on the Alaskan trips when I was talking about whales. I did, and I don't know how many of you were on my cruise. I know a couple of you were here, or on that ship, on the Spirit. But I talk about killer whales. And there's this one series of images that I show. Now, killer whales, we know, will kill seals they don't want to be involved, because seals, part of the canine descendancy, like they've got big teeth. They will bite you and it will hurt. Killer whales don't want to get involved in that. So a lot of the times what they'll do is they'll go back and they'll kick the seal with their tails, stun it, make it so it can't fight back as much. Sometimes they'll kick it into the air. So when it comes back down, it's stunned or dazed, and then it's an easy prey. The image that I showed at the end of my lecture, and I always ended my lecture like this because it says something about me, obviously. And I showed this image of a killer whale kicking the seal well over 100 feet into the air. There is no reason to kick a seal that high. When it hit the water again, falling from 100 feet, it was going to be dead. It didn't need to be dead. It just needed to be, dazed or unconscious. And then what followed up with this, the one that made it interesting, is that particular killer whale didn't eat that seal. He kicked it into the air, well higher than it needed to be, watched it fall back down, and just left it. It was dead, and that animal was dead. And this goes into the idea that, just because they're smart doesn't mean they're nice. Just because they're smart, there's a certain subset of our population as humans that are just jerks, folks. They're maybe psychopaths that are just, they do stuff because you're like, what is wrong with you? There is no reason to think, just like, we like to alter our state of consciousness, and the dolphins do as well. There's no reason to think that these higher intelligence animals don't have a lot of the same sort of things going on that we do. In that particular case, that animal, I don't know, maybe he had asked out another one of the killer whales that he liked in the pod. He's like, oh, hey, Susie, you want to go out on Friday? She's like, with you? No. And he's swimming around. He's like, oh, man. And that seal just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And he's like, oh. The seal just goes up 100 feet into the sky. Just because they're smart, folks, doesn't mean that they're super pleasant. It's going to be a certain subset of the population that are going to be jerks, that are going to be crazy. They're going to be psychopaths, just like in people. A small percentage of us. Hopefully most of them aren't in this room. But this sort of, and I'm not trying to give you anthropomorphic impressions of these animals. I'm certainly not. But I think this is something that unites us with the rest of the natural world. Maybe it's not a human thing. Maybe it's just an intelligent animal thing. To sometimes just have a bad day and take it out on something who was not the cause of your problem at all. You're just livid, so you're taking it out. This makes sense to me. This makes sense that it wouldn't be just us. It would be the bulk of the intelligent animal kingdom. You know, actually, that's a good segue. That being said, I realized that there's been a lot of things on this cruise that have kind of gone sideways and made people a little bit frustrated and angry. And I recognize that frustration and anger, folks, and my heart goes out to you. It does, honestly. You're on vacation. We all want you to have a great time. I want you to try to look beyond that immediate knee-jerk rage that you might have, because I'm finding a disturbingly large amount of complaints on the ship, and I just want you to try to look beyond your minor inconveniences and to enjoy your time with us. We all want the same thing, which is for you to have a great time. And none of us are doing anything we can to not get you there. I realize that sometimes we fail epically. This is true. This is true that we do sometimes. But it's certainly not by design, and it's not by intention. And I hope that you can understand that. It's sort of me going back into this. I can't believe I connected those two things. But yeah, it's the idea that we're in a wonderful spot. We're having a great time. Sort of enjoy the positivity of where we're at and not necessarily dwell on the things that went sideways, folks. That being said, glad that resonated with you. Jeez, shoot, I should have done the whole talk like that. At any rate, that's the end of this portion. That was all the interesting things that I wanted to tell you about that I felt like Carnival is not going to have my head for me telling you about. At this point, let me see, what time is it? It is, okay, so we got about 15 minutes. So, if there is something that you have a question about, something you've seen, you didn't quite understand, something you want to know, yeah, you in the back. Oh, hold on a second, let's see how far this microphone goes. Get used to it. Oh yeah, and look at this. Good Lord, I didn't know this was possible. I've been walking around here the whole time.